Welcome to Common Ground with Bill Walton, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
It's a reality that U.S. politics are likely to be a source of frustration for years to come. But even if Washington remains impervious to change for people who want to improve America, there's hope. It's not as if there are only two problem-solving sectors in America, the public sector of government and the private sector of business. There's a third way, often a better way. Men and women pouring their energy and money into voluntary efforts to bring about positive change. This third way is about leveraging civil society to solve big social problems. With me today to talk about one of these initiatives are J.P. DeGance and Leah Hughey. J.P. is Executive Vice President at the Philanthropy Roundtable, where he runs the organization's Philanthropy Labs, and is a co-founder of the Culture of Freedom Initiative. Prior to this, he helped Americans for Prosperity formulate strategies for the policy and issue campaigns. Before that, he helped lead several Coke companies' special project teams to protect and advance economic freedom. He lives in Virginia with his wife, Christina, and they are raising 10 children.
Yeah.
Welcome, JP.
Thank you, Bill.
Lee Stiles Hughey is the Jacksonville City Director for the Flourishing project, which works alongside churches and individuals to serve the people of Jacksonville. Flourish Now is a partner and beneficiary of the Culture of Freedom Initiative. Raised in a family of pastors and human services professionals, Lee grew up in and around churches and Christian agencies dedicated to human dignity and the advancement of the gospel. Along with her husband, Jason, and several colleagues, Leah is a co-author of a recently published book, Called to Freedom, which is about the compatibility of a Christian worldview with a libertarian political philosophy. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So JP, let's do the personal part. 10 children.
10 children, yeah. We've got to get some cable, I think. We have seven children of our own, my wife and I, and we've been fortunate to be able to be in a position to also raise 3 of my siblings' children, and the sibling was in a position where she couldn't take care of them, and we were just blessed to be able to come and help her out, and help those kids out. So definitely know a little bit about what happens when families.
Well, that's one of the reasons you've gotten so involved in the family and culture and civil society solutions. Your personal experience with.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of times when families break down, if there isn't a family there to step in and there isn't civil society solutions, the state steps in, and the state's a blunt instrument. And foster care is a really messy way to solve family problems, and oftentimes a necessary way to solve those problems. But when families are able to step in, and church institutions and civil society is able to come to the aid, oftentimes you have a far better outcome.
And you're a firsthand example of that working. So, Leah, you describe as where you come from as coming from the family business. Tell me about the family business.
Sure. So both of my parents are ordained ministers, and my brother is a licensed youth pastor. And in my whole childhood, the church was just the fabric of the community that surrounded my brother and me. And my dad, before becoming a full-time minister, worked in human services. And so he worked for an organization called New Day in Altoona, Pennsylvania, and it was in a brownstone downtown. And he would take my brother and me to work with us. And there was this living area that had a fireplace where they did the counseling, and then there was a kitchen behind that. And my brother and I would play in that kitchen while my dad did the work of the church. And I didn't realize it then that the word for that was civil society, or that it was, the church fulfilling its social function. But as I grew up and started getting this vocabulary and reading authors like Tocqueville, I realized that's what my family has been doing for decades. So I decided to jump in.
Both of you, what do we mean by civil society? I mean, that's a $5 word. What break it down?
Civil society is the voluntary associations that we all belong to. That oftentimes it might be a nonprofit, it might be a church, it might just be me and 5 parents from my softball team that jump in and take some action.
It's people voluntarily organizing,
Yeah.
whether it's a church, a community group, a sports team, whatever. Leah, do you have?
Absolutely. Well, Alexis de Tocqueville calls those things secondary institutions. So it's sort of that layer between the individual actor and the government. So groups that have done things like start schools and hospitals and libraries and have just tackled some of the biggest problems by just associating with next door neighbors and looking and seeing a need and deciding to do something about it.
And civil society is a uniquely American, I won't say uniquely, but it's what
The
defines
level,
America.
the size and vitality of civil society in America is definitely unique.
Because Paul Johnson wrote a book about American history, and he made the point that even by 1900, most Americans had no dealings with government whatsoever, and that everything had gotten done, all the charitable activity, all of the helping each other happened through civil society, not through government or through a business.
Right. In our history, you don't have great examples of famines wiping out tens of thousands of people. And a lot of, we've got the world's greatest university system, and that was largely started by, almost entirely started by civil society.
So let's talk about, tell me about the Philanthropy Roundtable and the culture of flourishing or culture of freedom, and also the flourishnow.org. What are your organizations, and how are we going about addressing the issues you want to address?
Yeah, well, the Philanthropy Roundtable is really a membership organization of philanthropists from around the country interested in solving the country's greatest problems through charitable endeavors. And the Culture of Freedom Initiative is a specific project within the Philanthropy Roundtable that's trying to find replicable solutions to some of the most intractable social problems facing the country that are closely tied to human flourishing and American freedom. So that means, in a way, strengthening the family, strengthening faith institutions. These are the two strong pillars of both civil society and the strongest elements of what's called social capital, which is our intangible connections to our family, voluntary associations, all those sorts of relationships that research is increasingly showing that if you have more social capital in the individual, he or she is going to be far more able to become upwardly mobile. That community is going to have less multi-generational poverty and all of those good things. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So Flourish Now, the nonprofit that I work for, is a partner organization and, as you said, a recipient of the Culture of Freedom Initiative. And our missional mandate is to help solve systemic poverty through empowering the local church to really get in there and solve difficult to solve societal problems at the local level. So the main way that we do that is by partnering with churches, coming alongside neighborhoods they're already serving, populations of people that they've already identified as those that they would like to reach out to, as well as just inviting the broader city to come and see what that church is all about. And one of the major programs that we do are job fairs in churches, because we've identified that about 65% or so of American churches have a benevolence program. So if you go and you say, I can't pay my light bill, or we need some assistance with food, 65% of American churches can do something immediate, but only 2% of American churches have an employment ministry. So if the same family is coming back to the church month after month for that electric bill, a lot of churches are not equipped to then say, yes, actually, if you come to this job fair or if you come to this recovery style job club, we will help you through mentorship and through that social capital that JP was talking about, to thicken that layer of support around that person through the tangible love of people to solve that problem.
What I understand is that the culture of freedom really is trying to develop solutions to social issues at a specific local level, in your case, Jacksonville, and then be able to replicate that solution around the country. Find out what works and not have to go and reinvent it someplace else, but take what works in Jacksonville, Columbus, Ohio, Kansas City, Sacramento.
Right. That's right. And it's led by a group of business leaders, folks who've been successful entrepreneurs, franchisors, investors, and taking that sort of business approach, a metrics-based approach, and applying it to some areas that seem really hairy, really intractable. So when I talk about social capital, really, it sounds like it's a really clean term, but really the two strongest parts of it is this person in a family, in an intact family? Does this person practice or belong to some sort of religious institution? If you have those two things, there's a lot of great outcomes that flow from it. And a lot has been written about, whether it's Charles Murray in Coming Apart, or Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone, Raj Chetty in his research out of Harvard, talking about the fragmentation of family, the disintegration of community, and its connection to human flourishing. And what sets the Culture Freedom Initiative apart is that we're not looking at trying to study those issues. We think other folks have done a great job of that. We're trying to roll up our sleeves and say, what can be done about it? Can private actors jump in and help a family become intact or not break down? Well,
you've had some success in Jacksonville with divorce rates.
Yes.
Let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, there's 4 big measure areas that we're looking at. We want to see if we increase the marriage rate, decrease the divorce rate, decrease single parenthood, and increase church attendance, religious observance. In Jacksonville, we've gotten a lot of traction. It's one of our 3 test markets. By the end of this year, we expect the divorce rate to be 25 to 29% lower than it was before the initiative started 24 months ago.
That's tremendous. That's happened almost nowhere else in the country, has it?
Yeah, no, it's a statistical outlier. And really, how it's been done is, we know sort of an assumption that we've made is life changes through relationship. What we want to do is see what we can do to help scale life-changing relationships in these cities. Another big assumption is that there's enough content in the world to save the world. If content alone was the solution, the world would have been saved a while ago. So our value proposition is try to make that content catalytic in the form of life-changing relationships. So
good ideas doesn't do it. Changing behavior does it.
That's right. And so ideas are important.
Yeah.
Well, an important part of the syllogism, but they're not the final part of it, right? So before we got started in Jacksonville, we did an assessment and baselined. There was about 300 individuals had gone through in the entire city, programs around marital enrichment, marriage formation, marriage in crisis sorts of ministries from parachurches and church organizations. And over the course of 2016, we increased that by a factor of 35 in the county. And so that was significantly focused using the advances of big data and predictive science. We were able to focus a lot of that attention on the folks who were in the greatest need.
So I think implicit in what we're saying, though, is you believe, I believe, that most of the solutions occur best locally. I think there's another $5 word for that, subsidiarity, which is the Catholic term. There's another term you mentioned, Leah, before we got on, is sphere sovereignty.
Yeah, that was something JP and I were even talking about on the way over here. And essentially that there's different spheres of responsibility between individuals.
Everybody talks about sphere sovereignty.
Of course, everywhere. You're in the grocery store checking out bananas, sphere sovereignty, 50 cents.
It's a common
It is. But
so
it's,
let's talk about what is sphere sovereignty.
Yeah, it's essentially the idea that there's responsibility relegated to the individual, to families, to churches, to government, and it's about keeping those various actors in society within the proper place and allowing the free movement and action of the other actors in the sector for which they're responsible. Do you have something to add to that? We've had quite a conversation about it. So you probably do.
Ultimately, whether it's sphere sovereignty or subsidiarity, it's the idea that the greatest problems and challenges that face a society should first be addressed by those closest to it, right? And there are oftentimes folks who have the greatest knowledge, the greatest passion for solving the problem. And instead of quickly elevating the problem to a point where there ought to be a law or we need to have government intervention. Again, government is a pretty blunt instrument to solving a lot of problems.
Well, Hayek had the notion of a fatal conceit. He didn't think people could sit in an office in a let's say, Brussels in the case of Europe and
Sure.
solve the problems of a farmer in Normandy. And I think
Yeah.
we think the people in Normandy ought to solve, although you're focused on Jacksonville, but people closest to their issue ought to be the people responsible for the solution.
Yeah, I was looking for the quote. I talked about Tocqueville already, but he was talking about the idea of a central power and the ability of a large central state to solve local problems. And his words were, "Such a work exceeds human strength."
Yeah.
And so he talked about the necessity, and so did F.A. Hayek, who you were referencing, of trusting individual local actors to know those problems innately. But Tocqueville also adds this element of compassion, that when you assist someone who is a neighbor, or when you make that personal touch and build that layer of social capital with someone that JP referenced, you develop empathy, you develop compassion, and suddenly something that goes from this statistic of millions of people are on dependency programs, it turns down to this woman
Yeah.
who lives 6 blocks from me is on food stamps for a
Right.
reason.
Yes.
She's a single parent. She has 4 children. She's trying to raise them alone. How do we fix that? How do we get the local church involved? Well, she's unemployed. Oh, well, how do we use the local church to try to leverage networks to help her get employed? She doesn't have a car. Okay, well, there's surely a nonprofit in town that could give her one, or we could give her some bus passes. And you start suddenly seeing through that interaction that you become much more compassionate and much more compassionate and interested in helping to solve those problems then from the individual to the community level. And
What
that's a
you're
beautiful
talking about
thing.
really is the church is able to do, and civil institutions are better able to do 2 big things: discern and love.
Yes.
And the state is really difficult. It finds it hard to do both of those things.
Yeah.
Love is something that's hard to be legislated.
Yes.
And so those are big parts of this.
One of the things that makes me excited about the culture of freedom is that we're not talking about just doing this in Jacksonville. You mentioned that you've got people from business who have franchise backgrounds involved with it, and the idea is to take what's working in Jacksonville and replicate it.
Sure.
Explain how the Colonel gets involved in this.
Sure. One of, a number of the business folks on this have been really involved in successful
Holiday
franchising
Inn,
experts.
yeah.
Holiday Inn, you're talking about Einstein Bagels,
Yeah.
a variety of different
Very successful,
programs.
yeah.
And they said to me in a meeting, one of our business partners said, we're trying to franchise like Kentucky Fried Chicken franchised. To which I said, absolutely, that's exactly what we're trying to do. For the sake of everybody else in the room, can you explain how that worked? And so I had no idea how it worked, of course. And so the way KFC originally franchised was the Colonel had a great recipe. And instead of trying to build storefronts in town after town after town, he knew he had a great recipe and some great ingredients. And so he sold the franchise by taking recipes to mom and pop diners around the country, right? That were looking for great things to add to their menu. And analogously, there's a lot of great organs of civil society, what Edmund Burke called little platoons, that exist out there. The church is certainly perhaps the strongest organ of civil society, but there's a lot of other civil associations and secular associations that exist. And so what we're working to do is develop and know the recipe that we can then take to lots of other civil institutions and scale it.
Well, if you
that
could take
way.
a 30% reduction in divorce all over the country, you will have accomplished something big. So let me drill into it. So you're working with churches in Jacksonville, and you're counseling. In your case, you're focusing a lot on people getting back into the workforce. But we're also counseling people on marriage and staying married. You would then take this to other churches in other cities, and you would show them there'd be a playbook on how to do that, the way a franchisee has a playbook from a franchisor. Is that the idea?
Sure, and there's really 3 different steps. A first step is we provide great advanced data science to these churches, stuff that exists in the for-profit sector right now. Large companies like Google and Amazon have access to a lot of data. We put a lot of that data in the hands of the executive director of a local civil association, put it in the hands of a pastor, and we can help them understand, 35% of your congregation is credit card dependent. 24% of your congregation looks like it fits a high predictive model for divorce. Now, all of a sudden, the pastor or the executive director sees what's going on in his own pews or in his own membership and takes ownership of the problem. It becomes personally owned by them. that stimulates them taking their passion and action to solving the problem. Then we curate content and we recommend great partners like Flourish Now to come in and resolve certain issues that might be going on in their congregation. Other great partners like Alpha USA, there's Family Life Ministries, the Augustine Institute has great programs. So there's a variety of different off-the-shelf content that can be curated and live in a particular church or nonprofit setting. And then last is we provide what we call scaling help. And so what we do is we've been developing methods to drive an increase in attendance at a particular event or even Sunday worship.
So Lee, we say we. Who is we? I mean, how many people are involved with this in Jacksonville? How many? And what do you? How do you marshal the troops to solve these problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have about 10 staff at Flourish Now nationally, and we're very collaborative, and each city is a little bit like an R&D shop. So when we began, we were founded in 2015, so we're very new, and the objective was to keep families together and to help the church be a huge part of that. And so at first, in our headquarters area, we were doing a foster prevention program called Safe Families for Children, which gave volunteer families within churches the opportunity to host children for temporary periods of time while parents went through periods of crisis. But it wasn't like foster care in that the parents didn't lose custody of the children that time. It was a voluntary arrangement. So they figured that out, got that down really well. We're confident in that and thought, okay, great. Well, we're preventing families from splintering in this way. Surely there's more we can do. So we looked at the data, saw that about 80% of the time, the reason children had to be hosted with us was because of an economic or financial need. So we decided, my leadership decided to roll out employment ministry, but they weren't exactly sure what that looked like. So we have some curriculum and we do recovery-style job clubs in churches that can be anywhere between 6 and 16 weeks. But then we started trying job fairs, and it took off instantaneously. It's a concept that churches get behind. In the first 6 months of activity in Jacksonville, we've served 1,400 people. Our national average is about 56% of people within 6 weeks of a job fair get employed. And those people, roughly half of them that come through the job fairs are not part of a local church. So we talk about building that social capital. Think about it. If you're unemployed and you come to a church, maybe you've never been there before, and you have a great conversation with a volunteer, they pray for you, they encourage you, and you get a job, then the next time you have that need for community, that church is the first place you're going to go. So we've seen some wonderful just one-off stories of people ending up part of the social fabric of that church, continuing to be part of it.
Yeah, it's really exciting what's happening down there because, Bill, you've got programming that's happening in marriage enrichment, workforce development, evangelization, family, sort of parenting skills. We were chatting earlier about a particular church in Jacksonville. It's a great example of what happens when all of these things start coming together.
Crossroad United Methodist. Yeah, we did a job fair with them in February, and you talk about how do you marshal the troops. Well, when I first got to Jacksonville, I met with a lot of pastors and just talked to them about what are you doing right now to solve problems you see in the community? How could you do that differently?
React to this, though? You come in and say, "Well, look, you've been saving souls. Now we want you to help people get jobs." How do they react?
Most of the time, they're very excited about it.
Yeah.
They're invigorated because if you think about Jesus's ministry, Jesus preached and fed. He preached and healed. And so there was this element that teaching and beautiful ideas and the salvation of the soul was always tied with the meeting of the immediate material need. And so I think churches inherently know that, which is why they're so good about doing things like having benevolence ministries or having a food pantry. So I think they're excited about it because theologically, people were made to work. They were made to contribute. They were made to design, to create, to do wonderful, beautiful, and beneficial things for society. And so if the church gets to be part of helping people to fulfill the purpose for which they were created, then they flourish. And churches, I think, have been extremely excited about that. So that's been very rewarding.
I think you said before we came on that if we had the same percentage of people in the workforce now as we'd had, 10, 15 years ago, we'd have 10 million more people?
Yeah, if you had the same workforce participation rates
participation rate,
today
yeah.
as we had in the year 2000, you'd have about 10 million more people in the workforce. That was a statistic from Nicholas
amazing.
Eberstadt. When you, in terms of looking at the labor, the Bureau of Labor's
Well, and
data.
you know, I think we all believe that Arthur Brooks is onto something with his earned success idea, and that
Yes.
without work, there is no earned success.
Right. It's hard to feel dignity too, right?
is.
And so it's, I think so what we're doing is we've got, in my world, we've got business methods being applied to social problems using the third way, and we've got big data, we've got predictive modeling, we've got a franchise concept. The other thing I find exciting, I was at one of your workshops, and that we talk about church attendance is highly related to human
Yeah.
flourishing, isn't it? I mean,
it definitely
there's something
is.
like the daily, if you go to church each week, X amount of good things happen.
Right.
Whatever.
There's a lot of data actually coming out of Harvard now.
Harvard?
Of all places. Dr. Tyler Vanderweel has been doing a lot of
started out as a
research.
Christian college.
This is a Harvard professor who said that perhaps our country's biggest miracle drug is going to church. That all sorts of public health outcomes are just generally better for folks who regularly participate in some level of religious worship. And what you see is an individual's ability to withstand bouts of unemployment. Your time span of being unemployed is less if you're engaged in a religious community, and that should stand to reason, because an individual in a church or attending a synagogue or a mosque is going to know more people, right? And when he or she is unemployed, is going to be able to more quickly find a job, and so there's all sorts of a collateral impact.
And as I recollect, this was a heavily peer-reviewed piece of research. I mean, it was not just somebody's opinion.
Right. No,
This
no, no.
actually happens.
This is a published piece of peer-reviewed science that has been taking a lot of looks at the impact of religiosity on both, looking at public health, and there's a variety of other impacts as it relates to employment.
Shifting gears to a related topic, we've been talking a lot about churches and Christianity and the need to bring about things through that, but I think your book, Leah, Call to Freedom, is why you can be a Christian and a libertarian. Let's talk about that, because Christians, I don't know what percentage of the country, but what would be appealing to this to somebody who's a libertarian, economic conservative, who doesn't think of themselves as a church person?
Well, the impetus for the book was to sort of answer that question. So there were a group of us that were part of a reading group who self-identified somewhere on the conservative libertarian spectrum, but who wanted to try to explore further this reconciliation question, because we know there are a lot of Christians who are hesitant about the term libertarian, and there are a lot of libertarians who are hesitant about the word Christian, and we didn't think that was necessary. So I think that something that is appealing about the idea of a civil society-driven solution for, let's say, a libertarian who isn't a Christian, is that libertarians want the size and scope of government to shrink, but sometimes we disagree about the why and the how. And so I think something that civil society-focused Christians have to offer is a real solution that has data that backs it up, that has case after case after case of ways that it's worked to have government a little bit less involved in some of these spheres where individuals and churches should be responsible.
So even if you're not a believer, there's a utilitarian reason to show that this works.
Definitely, that it works. Philanthropy is necessary.
Yeah.
The idea of having religious institutions, I mean, I keep going back to it, but Tocqueville himself was not an inherently religious man.
He's a pretty smart
And
guy.
He's great. I love him. My husband knows. But he talked about the fact that religion is the first of America's political institutions, because religious participation makes you more ready to solve social problems. It makes you more ready to take risks, because you know that there's more than just life. There's more than just your treasure chest. There's something waiting beyond. And so when people participate in religious activities, there are great outcomes for society that are not engineered by some person in a marble palace 3,000 miles away. They're engineered by the people down the street. And so libertarians are always asking, if we get government to be small, what will we do next? Well, the next thing is to step up and take responsibility for what's left.
And that's something that a lot of times A lot of libertarians get that, and unfortunately, a lot of them don't.
You work for Charles Koch, who's I
Yeah,
think
for a
is
time.
terrific
Yeah,
guy.
yeah.
He's a very serious libertarian.
He
I mean,
is.
how does he how do you come out of that milieu into this, and what's your personal? I mean, elaborate.
Sure. Well, it's funny. Was meeting with a high net worth business leader from California, and was sharing some of the data on these social factors, looking at family breakdown, okay, and how it's closely connected to a lot of bad economic outcomes. Look at it, how it's closely connected to a lot of different philosophical worldviews that maybe aren't consistent with a free society approach to solving problems. And the immediate response from this gentleman was, as he looked at the family breakdown numbers, he said, "Oh, it should just be." He flippantly said, "I guess it should just be illegal then for people to be born outside of wedlock then, and we should mandate that people go to synagogue or church."
That doesn't sound very libertarian.
That was his flippant response. And what he
Okay.
was basically speaking to is, you can point out, he was trying to say, JP, you can point out these problems, but there's nothing that can be done about it. That's, in his mind, the problem solving mechanism is either the state or the individual. And he lacked an understanding of the mediating institutions for solving problems.
Yeah.
And there's some great examples in our own history of the biggest and the hairiest problems being solved by civil actors. You look at, in the early 19th century, the average American consumed more than 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year.
Good
Okay, so to put that in perspective, you're talking about a 500 milliliter handle about every 2 weeks being consumed by everyone. A historian said that the American drinks from the crack of dawn to the crack of dawn. And so what happened? Many years before there was anything like a prohibition movement, there was a temperance movement in the early part of the 19th century, and there were philanthropists and civil actors that started to create the Temperance Societies and the Anti-Saloon League. There were efforts to try to help men associate without having to drink while they have fun and meet people. There was money put behind creating plays and songs to help promote the idea of temperance. And the effect was long before the prohibition happened. In the early 1900s, you had a reduction of alcohol consumption by 70%. Wow. And that wasn't because of a government program. It wasn't because government actors got involved. It was because a lot of believers got involved in working together to create change.
Slavery is another one. The civil society, people, individuals, pastors, regular citizens, everybody was involved in bringing slavery to an end. And I think the government, in fact, was trying to keep slavery in place. Yeah. And so you've had the civil society. It wasn't government that brought the change.
Yeah, actually, the first direct mail campaign was funded by an anti-slavery Christian activist who began a mailing campaign to educate people on the problems of slavery and build a national consensus. That sort of activity created riots even in parts of the country that didn't have slavery. Folks who were opposed to that kind of civic activism. Mm-hmm. So, in many ways, the broad abolition movement was a movement of activists, significantly funded by great philanthropists like the Tappan brothers, who put their money where their mouth was. These guys, in many ways, did. We hear a lot about guys like George Soros or the Koch brothers today, but the Tappan brothers probably had a greater impact.
Who are the Tappan brothers?
The Tappans were businessmen from evangelical Christians that operated in Manhattan, and they were devout capitalists who realized that there was all sorts of cultural rot going on around them. They actually helped kickstart the Second Great Awakening and revivals around the northern part of the country. They actually bought an old circus that had a lot of seedy activity in Manhattan and then turned it
and
into
the second Great Awakening was when many Americans believed that they had to improve themselves morally and had a responsibility to improve society at large. I mean, that was something that was not in the
and sometimes we refer to these things, and sometimes I think we refer to these historic movements as if they were naturally existing and would have happened anyways. But there's actually real people created the Second Great Awakening, actors in civil society, churches, and philanthropists had a huge part in stoking the flames that created that renewal that created the Sunday school movement. The United States of America became the most literate, went from being one of the least literate to the most literate nation on the planet, long before public schools were universal. By the mid 1840s, the U.S. had become the world's most literate because of Sunday schools and the explosion of Sunday schools around the country.
So, as I said at the outset, there is hope. I mean, we're so caught up in everything being politicized now. And
if I might share a local example too that shines some light on that. So I think, those movements are fantastic examples of how a small, maybe one person doing Sunday school and realizing this has a direct impact on literacy then spreads to become, a nationwide phenomenon. And in Jacksonville, I've had the pleasure of working with a couple of churches and nonprofit organizations in a neighborhood called Brentwood. And if you're driving around Jacksonville, Florida, and you drive through Brentwood, you immediately see need. The first thought is need, and then the second thought often is hopelessness, of thinking the only possible way that this neighborhood could be saved or improved is by some kind of government blight program, or by some state level or even federal level law or piece of legislation that will dramatically change this neighborhood. And for instance, the crime rate in Brentwood is 120% higher than the national average. The unemployment rate in Brentwood is 99% higher than the national average. So it's one of those neighborhoods that it's just, the need is overwhelming. So we partnered with a local nonprofit there, a ministry called Second Mile that does after-school programs. And we partnered with Crew Inner City, which does adult development and helps adults with a vast variety of needs. And then two churches that are just very interested in helping people in that community live better lives because they love them and they love them authentically. And they found out about our job fairs and said, we have to bring one of these to Brentwood because unemployment is such a problem here. Single moms that just have no way to care for their children, and men that want to be involved in their children's lives. But to JP's point, men aren't marriageable in many instances until they have work. And so they're ashamed, and they don't want to be around their sons because they don't want their sons to end up like them. So how do you break that cycle? By bringing employment. So long story short, we had a job fair in July. 284 people came. 40 got jobs on the spot. 80 people went through workshops. And that neighborhood about 3 months later got really hard hit by Hurricane Irma. And so churches and nonprofits have been helping that neighborhood to rebuild after Hurricane Irma. And I was down there and had a moment with the pastor of the Ville Church, one of our primary partners. And he was cleaning up drywall and was wet from head to toe and was thinking about his own home, which had been flooded. And his first question to me, whenever we had a moment alone, was, when can we do the next job fair in this community? Because employment is such a necessary need. And so you talk about scale. There are Brentwoods in every city in America. You can drive down the street in Philadelphia and see a Brentwood. You can drive down the streets of LA and see a Brentwood. And so I have hope because I saw that day people's lives changing. I saw women crying, ringing our opportunity bell because they had gotten jobs, saying, my children are going to have a better life because I came to this event. And so if we can get philanthropists and individuals and business people and volunteers rallied around the idea that we can bring hope and beauty and human flourishing to the Brentwoods in every city in America, just think of the transformation. It could be a beautiful thing, and it will be a beautiful thing.
Tell us a little bit, Leah, the way you guys do the job fairs is pretty neat, because here you've got a church that wants to do something, but maybe doesn't yet know how.
Sure.
And you guys provide a key catalytic aid to those churches to help get these job fairs off the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've partnered nationally with hundreds of businesses in Jacksonville, almost 100 different companies. And we have relationships with people from owners to, folks on the HR team. And so a lot of churches don't know where to begin to get 30 businesses in the door to set up at a job fair. They don't know the logistics of how to do that. So we say, don't worry about it. We'll handle the marketing. We'll handle the business development. We'll handle the event planning. You worry about loving the dickens out of the people that come through the door and loving the people in your community so well that they want to come. And so we get there the day of, we set up, and church volunteers, as many as 25, 30 church volunteers come, and they talk to every person that comes through the door. They have personal relationships that develop on the spot that sometimes last for months and months afterward. And what we do then is basically pull the strings like a curtain operator at a play and let the church do their thing. But I think the most unique element is, I mentioned we have an opportunity bell. And so when someone gets a job, they and their new hiring manager, their new boss, come and ring this bell together. And sometimes you'll have 200 people in the room at once, and everyone stands still. And for about 15 seconds, claps, cheers, looks at the person that just got a job. And often, the person will come in like this, and they'll maybe have their resume, and they're shy. My name is Leah, and I am looking for a job. When they ring that bell, they explode.
Yeah.
And you can see on their face, in their body language, that they just got a new lease on life because of the opportunity they had, because they get to ring that bell. And then volunteers from the church mob the person. Oh, congratulations, that's so wonderful. What's your job going to be? Do you need clothes? Do you need a ride to get there? Well, what's next? And so you see those catalytic relationships happen, and they happen in a church.
Yeah.
It's a really beautiful thing.
This is exciting. Thank you. We've run out of time, but how would we reach you? Flourish-now.org.
That's right. Absolutely.
And I recommend your book, Called to Freedom.
Oh, thank you.
Which is available on Amazon. And I think it's a must read. I'm going to send this to all my libertarian friends so they'll understand.
Please do.
And some of my Christian friends as well,
Yeah.
so we can all work together effectively. JP,
Absolutely.
how do we reach you?
Yeah, you can, someone can go to the website, cultureofreedom.org.
Yeah.
And they can also email me at jdegance, DEGANCE, at philanthropyroundtable.org.
Okay, and this will all be available on the website for those of you that weren't taking notes quickly. But this is exciting. This is a way to bring a lot of good things to every community in
Time
America.
to stop
Amen.
cursing the darkness, right? We got to
Grab flashlights.
Exactly.
Run in there.
Right.
Okay, here's the flashlight.
That's right.
Great having you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe to Common Ground with Bill Walton on iTunes.